Greetings and welcome to the 8th episode of Morrowind Modding Reviews, our series where we take texture replaces for a particular architectural set and compare them side by side for your viewing pleasure. Today we're going to be doing the second part of our Redoran series, looking at 4 different Redoran retextures. And this will probably be our last Great House episode for a little while. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but we've mainly been focusing on Great House Talalu, Talvani, and Redoran. And I'd like to do something just a little bit different in the next episode, like maybe cover the Velothi architectural set or the Imperial architectural set. So I'm just going to try and switch it up a bit, and if you have a particular suggestion for something you'd like to see, just post a comment down below and I'll take that in consideration. And to start off with, we're going to be checking out Faylynn's Redoran Retexture by Faylynn, yet another one of the many retextures that Faylynn created over the years. And just like with our last Redoran episode, we're going to start out in the tiny village of Morrowind, and right away you can tell that this is a sort of white plaster-like texture replacer that's sort of painted over the buildings, walls, and staircases. And up close you can notice that the texture has a fair bit of wear and tear to it, with areas where the plaster has just sort of broken down. And from an immersion perspective, it would be easy to relate this to the constant blight storms that come down from Red Mountain and batter these Redoran settlements. And moving on to Run, I can really say that I just honestly like the way these exterior textures look. They're not exactly the traditional Redoran style, but they work fairly well with the architecture, and they're of a pretty good quality, and it does offer an interesting contrast with the Ashlands in general, with white buildings sitting on a much darker grey terrain. And another thing to point out is that this package does also include textures for Underscar as well. We're quickly moving on to the interior side of things. We're first stopping by the Aldscar Inn, and here you can see the interior textures are more of that white plaster, similar to the exterior, but you also find what appears to be some sort of rust-colored marble stonework outlining the railings and particularly noticeable along the floors. And down below, the ceilings are a kind of light-colored pattern with some sort of etching on them, sort of an interesting design, and it works rather well with these central lining pillars here, which kind of remind me of bones for some reason. And changing the lighting setting a bit with the Mages Guild and their bluish coloration, you can see that these textures hold fairly well in the mystical-like blue lighting here, with plaster walls and floors, some more of those patterned ceilings along with a few marble ceilings down in the central chamber here. And again, I have to say the archways just really remind me of bones, making it feel like I'm traveling through the insides of some unearthly beast when I walk around these interiors, which is a kind of cool side effect. And lastly, we're going to take a look at this typical Redoran bedroom. And overall, these are some really good quality textures, covering both the exteriors and interiors, and also including textures for Underscar, which is a nice bonus. And I really like how these textures show wear and tear, fitting in with the constant barrage of blight storms in the region, and really I'd say these are fairly lore-friendly textures in general. Overall, this gets a 5 out of 5 from me, and I recommend it for players who want a different, more white-like look for the Redoran architectural set, but also want some sort of realistic worn feel as well. Our next mod is Redoran, Arkitektora of Vvardenfell by Tidy. And Tidy's Arkitektora series is a set of high-resolution texture replaces that aim to provide lore-friendly graphic upgrades for the architecture of Morrowind, and you can see that pretty well here with the city of Morrowind. The textures are very similar in coloration to their vanilla counterparts, but they feel more detailed and obviously higher resolution than you'll find in the original game. And going over to Run, you can see these textures in a bit of a different lighting setting here with the evening light, and they really are quite nice, reminiscent of the bygone days of 2002, and strongly in keeping with that original Redoran feel of Ashland cities, and it really is quite a scenic looking texture replacer that really just enhances the original textures instead of just replacing them entirely. And moving on to look at some interiors, we're again starting with the Aldscar Inn, and you'll notice that these textures are still fairly similar to vanilla Morrowind, with plaster-like walls and what appears to be a sort of grey cobblestone floor that looks really nice with the rest of the interior. And heading off down below, you'll notice that the ceilings here appear to be a sort of grey colouring with a slight hint of blue mixed in for good measure, making for what I think is a fairly good combination overall with the floors and walls. And going back to the Mages Guild for some lighting comparisons, you'll notice some pretty cool looking ceramic patterns along the wall over here by the staircase that adds a little bit of character to the interior. And going down into the Mages Guild pit, you can see some more of this really lovely looking ceramic patterns on the ceiling. And it really is quite striking, probably my favorite part of these interior textures thus far. And you'll also notice that this texture package includes new textures for the Redoran doors as well, which is a nice little bonus since not every package does that. And finally, you can see a typical Redoran bedroom here, again quite cozy looking if I do say so myself. And sort of in conclusion, this is a really high quality texture package that's particularly designed to be lore friendly, blending in extremely well with all the other environments in Morrowind. And overall, I give this a 5 out of 5, and I'll recommend it for players who want a high resolution, but vanilla style and more importantly lore friendly Redoran retexture for your game. And it should be particularly noted that this is a very detailed texture replacer and not just a higher resolution of the vanilla textures included in the game. Next up for our third mod, we're going to be looking at Ash Redoran Dark Grey by Ghoul. Now, compared to the previous retextures that we've shown, this is a much darker texture mod, adding a dark grey ash-like texture to the Redoran buildings in the Ashlands, fitting in rather well with the terrain as you can see here from the city of Vvardenfell. And also something to note is that this texture replacer covers Underscar as well, so the skyline here is rather consistent in colouring. And heading over to Morrowind, you'll notice that a lot of these Redoran buildings have a white outline, adding a bit of much needed contrast to the darker grey colour of the Redoran shells. And overall, the texture feel is a sort of, well, ashen I suppose. It kind of looks a bit like cracked charcoal or burned wood, not exactly a plaster type texture like we've seen previously. Moving on to the interior side of things, there's a slightly different style of coloration in here. While the walls are still that burned ash grey colour, the railings in particular in this tavern have a slightly green outline, and the floors are a type of hard cobbled stone, all of which adds an interesting contrast to the rest of the building. And down below we see a lot more of that light green colouring, including the ceiling, which you can sort of make out here in the dim light. And again, this is just an interesting choice to go along with the dark grey walls here. As always, heading over to the Mages Guild, these textures seem to work pretty well underneath a blue lighting setting, arguably better looking than before, and you'll also notice some more of that red ceramic texture from our last texture replacer, and I don't really think that's added by this mod. Since I installed texture replacers over each other, I suspect that's a leftover texture from Tidy's replacer, meaning that Ash Redoran might not necessarily replace that particular interior texture, which is a bit hard to tell and a bit odd if it does. And once again, here's the standard Mages Guild bedroom where the green ceiling is much more evident. Sort of wrapping up, there's some pretty good quality textures in use here, certainly a distinct visual style that matches well with the Ashlands, and there's even textures for Underscar, which is always a nice bonus. As for downsides, it may not necessarily be lore friendly, and some of the green interior textures are just a bit off for my liking. Overall, I give this a 4.9 out of 5, and I recommend it for players who want something completely different for the Redoran style that better matches with the dark landscape that Redoran cities can typically be found in. Now finally, the last mod we're going to cover is Korana's Redoran Textures by Korana, and this is yet another stylized texture replacer using white hues to color the Redoran buildings of Vvardenfell, as you can sort of see here. And this appears to be a sort of painted on like plaster texture, though I don't know if plaster really correctly describes the feel here, but in any event, much like Faylynn's texture replacer, you can tell that these buildings have a lot of wear and tear, with the paint chipping off of them, which is a pretty immersive quality considering again the ever-present blight storms of the region. And also worth mentioning is I believe this texture replacer has textures for Underscar as well, though obviously of a fairly different colour from many of the surrounding buildings. Over here in the small village of Morrowind, you can see more of that worn down chipped paint look on the exterior walls here, and you'll also notice a slight tan color that outlines a few of these buildings, such as the barracks and a couple of the huts. And really I have to say that I rather like the quality of these textures out here. They're really quite nice looking and add some contrast to the darker grey landscape of the Ashlands. And over on the interior side of things, we've got a warm mix of colours, with a mix of white, tan, and a little bit of red all evident in the textures here. The floors are composed of a really nice looking red stone tile, and the walls are more of that painted white plaster look, still pretty worn like the exterior, which I find pretty atmospheric myself. Downstairs we have a pretty interesting looking ceiling, with a mix of what might be a sky blue paint and a tan surface. The texture is designed in such a way as to suggest that the sky blue paint has mostly been flecked away, with the tan ceiling being the natural color underneath. And that just goes really well with the worn down theme that this texture replacer has, and over in the Mages Guild you can see some more of that lovely red ceramic tile, one of my favourite textures from this batch, along with some tan surfaces around the stairwell. You know, especially notice this tan coloration down in the Mages Guild pit, with the ceiling, and there's some slight hints of what might have been paint at one time scattered along the surface. And I also really want to point out the patterns on these archway pillars as well. They're a beautifully intricate mix of small red and tan ceramic tiles that come together wonderfully. And finally, you can see the typical Redoran bedroom here, and it's really quite the fascinating combination of textures that's going on in this texture set. And overall, these are some really superb and great quality exterior and interior textures, which I think are just quite lovely overall. An excellent use of wear and tear, which is pretty realistic given the environment, and there's also textures for underscar and Redoran doors, a nice bonus. The only downside is that the colors used may not be 100% lore friendly if we're going by a strict definition. And in any event, I give this a 5 out of 5, and I recommend it for people who want a high quality texture replacer that really shows off a degree of abuse consistent with life in the Ashlands. Anyway, that wraps up everything I have for you guys in this episode, and again, as I mentioned in the intro, I am thinking about covering something a little bit different next time, so if you have an idea for an architectural set you'd really like to see texture replacers for, just post a comment down below and we'll cover that next time. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, do please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.